Good evening, everybody. It's Diane Sayre here, the LaRouche candidate running against Chuck Schumer for U.S. Senate in 2022. Welcome to the New York Symposium. It's August 12th, and I'm sorry that I cannot be on by video, but I'm currently traveling from Batavia, New York, where I just attended a large rally, the Reawaken New York, Reawaken America rally, which the Attorney General of New York sought to prevent from occurring. She sent a very menacing letter to the pastor of the church who agreed to host it after the gathering was barred from coming into Rochester, New York. They were going to meet at the Armory there. And the Armory began getting threats. This involved people, Roger Stone was there, General Michael Flynn, various other people, Eric Trump. And so you can see the assault on the right of the American people and the American voters to be allowed to think for themselves continues. That's what we saw played out at Mar-a-Lago with the FBI raid on President Trump's home, the first time in American history that you've had such a raid on a former president of the United States. And that was quickly followed, as people may know, by a deposition courtesy of New York Attorney General Letitia James, where they're trying to secure, I forget what they call the death penalty for all of Trump's corporations and property in New York. And this is, as I said in a statement I released on this, really not so much about Donald Trump personally as it is an assault on the institution of the presidency of the United States, because our Constitution grants the president and the presidency a great deal of power, namely power to break from the policies of the British Empire. The British Empire has never forgiven us for the American Revolution. Roger Stone spoke there about the raid on his home in 2019, where there were, I think, 29 FBI agents, a helicopter, frogmen, some boats doing an amphibious landing. They spent 13 hours ransacking his home, doing everything they could to particularly humiliate his wife, as they did with Melania, going through all the closets and everything personal that you can. And, you know, the American people have really had it. But what I would like everyone to consider is, why are they resorting to these actions, this heavy-handed, we have to prevent you from even hearing a person. You don't even have a right to disagree with them. You don't have a right to even consider what they're saying. Well, because the transatlantic system is coming down. It's at its end, and you have a growing group of nations and leaders who are moving in the direction that Lyndon LaRouche outlined over years. It is reportedly said that Henry Kissinger expressed that the worst thing he could imagine happening is for Lyndon LaRouche to still be alive when that financial system came to its end. That is where we are now. And I have with me two guests who are longtime associates of Lyndon LaRouche, one of whom is Michael Billington, who courageously faced a 77-year jail sentence merely for his association with LaRouche, and they made up crazy charges, which I'll let him tell you about, and Dennis Speed, whom you know. And just to introduce both of them, I'd like to go now to a video compilation of some hearings held on the LaRouche case involving former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, LaRouche's wife, Helga Sepp LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche himself, and his attorney, Odin Anderson. I think this will give you some background as to what happened with that case.
Sometime about December of 1981, a representative of the U.S. government approached me and had asked me if I would be willing to set up an exploratory back-channel discussion with the Soviet government, because the Soviet government wanted according to them, an additional channel to discuss things. And I said didn't reject the idea. I said, but I have an idea on this question of nuclear missile. It was becoming increasingly dangerous, forward basing, more precise missiles, electromagnetic pulse. We're getting toward a first strike. It would be very useful to discuss what I proposed in my 1980 election campaign with the Soviet government to see if they'd be interested in discussing such a proposal. This might prove a profitable exploratory discussion. And so from February of 1983, or 82 through February 1982, I did conduct such back-channel discussions with representatives of the Soviet government in Washington, D.C. Those were somewhat fruitful, but ultimately abortive. Kissinger and others became aware of this discussion during the summer of 1982, and their circles were very much opposed to that. The general view was expressed, but that I was getting too big for my britches, and I had to be dealt with. On the question of debt, which some of these people were concerned about, and on this question of strategic missile defense.
This is the most incredible piece of FBI material, one of the most incredible pieces of FBI material that I've ever seen. And
CPUSA.
we're Communist Party. I'm going to get it. That's the Communist Party of the United States. What this suggests is that the Communist Party has let the FBI know that they want to eliminate Lyndon LaRouche for their political reasons. They consider him to be a politically dangerous person, and the Communist Party wants to eliminate him. If you look at the bottom, New York proposes submitting a blind memorandum to the Daily World to foster these efforts. Here's the FBI climbing in bed with the Communist Party in order to effect the elimination of Lyndon LaRouche from the political scene. I think we all know what that means.
But in what was as complex and pervasive a utilization of law enforcement, prosecution, media, and non-governmental organizations focused on destroying an enemy. This case must be number one. There are some where the government itself may have done more and more wrongfully over a period of time. But the very networking and combination of federal, state, and local agencies, of executive and even some legislative and judicial branches, of major media and minor local media, and of influential lobbyist types, the ADL preeminently. This case takes the prize.
Henry Kissinger, who we all know by name and some probably remember by reputation and actions, was a very powerful man. Mr. LaRouche took exception with his policies, which he considered to be genocidal, got into a serious row with Mr. Kissinger. And Mr. Kissinger writes to William Webster, the director of the FBI. Here is, within the short period thereafter, Buck Revell, who was the head of counterintelligence for the FBI at the time, sent this memorandum by William Webster, who was contacted by David Abshire of PIFIAB. That's the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And these same parties, Henry Kissinger and his colleagues, are now raising before PIFIAB the question as to whether LaRouche, because he seems to have funding from sources that they don't understand, is possibly operating as a foreign intelligence agent, and they want them to look into this. Now, what that does, and the words are bad enough, but the reality is terrifying. This triggers Executive Order 12333, which allows virtually any form of conduct, any activity, to be undertaken as long as it's under this national security cover. So this was the beginning of a national security covered operation against Mr. LaRouche and his colleagues.
The purpose can only be seen as destroying. It's more than a political movement. It's more than a political figure. It is those two. But it's a fertile engine of ideas. A common purpose of thinking and studying and analyzing to solve problems regardless of the impact on the status quo or on vested interests. It was a deliberate purpose to destroy that at any cost.
The most important in history is ideas, especially those ideas which move mankind forward, which are ideas which make the life of generations to come more human. And you can see it in those states which are governed by racism, like I saw it just in Alabama, where I thought Selma would be full of monuments for Martin Luther King, and I mean I was really totally shocked to see that the opposite was true. You see, when the absence of ideas is the case, like the absence of civil rights, the absence of human rights, how much misery that does to the people. So, for me, the biggest crime, what happened to my husband, is not that he was innocently in jail. And, I'm not saying it was not a hard time, because it was. And, I mean, I can only say that, people should feel the heart pain of what also Patricia Morris expressed, that, this is done to real human beings. It's not just some figures and statistics. People suffer. Their whole lives are being destroyed. But the lack of the ability to have important ideas govern history, that is the biggest crime. I'm saying this because, to put a man of great ideas into jail is a crime all by itself because of the ideas. The reason why we were able to mobilize hundreds of parliamentarians and thousands of VIPs from around the globe, why would people from Africa sign the parole request for Lyndon LaRouche? Why would people from Latin America do this? Why would people from around the world, from Russia, why would people come out of completely different cultural worlds to fight for this man? Well, because we not only said this man must be free and his innocence must be proven, but many of them told me and others that they understand that the kind of change in global policy my husband is standing for, the kind of just new world economic order which allows the economic development of Africa, which allows the economic development of the developing countries of Eastern Europe, they say is the only hope for them, for their nation, as far away as it may be.
Hello?
Yes. Are you there, Diane?
I am. That was the end of the video?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, you have to tell me because I can't see. Well, actually, it didn't include the section from Lynn I was hoping for, but why don't we go ahead, Mike, to what you have to say, because I think you will cover that and more.
Right. Okay. Actually, I will read that passage, probably the one you were thinking of. In those same 1995 hearings, Lyndon LaRouche said, in going back over why the LaRouche case happened and what it meant. He said, we have an out of control Justice Department, in my view, where the rot is not in the appointees as much as it is in the permanent bureaucracy. We have a permanent sickness in the permanent bureaucracy of part of our government. In my case, when the time came that somebody wanted me out of the way, they were able to rely upon that permanent injustice in the permanent bureaucracy of government to do the job. So this is, and then he goes through other cases, but this was what already existed in the United States back in the 1980s, actually much further beyond that. But to address the LaRouche case and to see the relationship between that case in the 1980s and what's going on today with the Trump raid and the Roger Stone raid that Diane just described. Roger Stone being somebody who was a very close friend of Lyndon LaRouche, had interviewed him several times and considered him a great genius, and obviously also was one of the people who encouraged Donald Trump to run for office. But the reality of what happened then in the 1980s is exactly the same as the reality today. And it's not who's in the presidency, it's not even who is necessarily the attorney general or the director of the FBI. It's a permanent bureaucracy which exists there as an asset of Wall Street, of the military industrial crowd, who, when they need a policy implemented, they can therefore carry out using wildly illegal, but nonetheless the power of the Justice Department to bring somebody down. Now, why? Lynn addressed that in what you just saw. He made the point that he had been the author of something that came to be known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, that he was a back channel connection for Ronald Reagan, who greatly admired Lyndon LaRouche and who had called on him actually to be a back channel connection to people in the Soviet Union. And when in 1983, Ronald Reagan adopted the proposal that Lyndon LaRouche had brought to him and to the Soviet Union, although the Soviets had turned it down. But nonetheless, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative to make nuclear missiles obsolete. And the idea behind this was that the US and the Soviets, whom LaRouche recognized had parallel and very profound military industrial complex capacity, meaning scientific capacity, to apply that capacity to a defense system that would do away with the British Henry Kissinger idea of mutual assured destruction, that we would prevent nuclear war by both the Soviets and the US pointing their nuclear missiles at each other, and therefore we won't start a war with each other because we'd blow each other up. But what did that mean? It meant the world was permanently divided into East versus West, as the British like to say, the free world versus godless communism, but basically keeping the world divided. And it justified carrying out colonial wars, like the Vietnam War, the wars in Africa, knowing that it would not escalate because these were surrogate wars. These were proxy wars, like the war you see now in Ukraine, which is clearly a war between the US and NATO on the one side and Russia on the others, using the Ukrainians to fight the Russians down to the last Ukrainian to see their country totally destroyed instead of reaching a peace. Same sort of proxy wars then, but not fearing that it would escalate to a nuclear war between the US and the Russians because you had mutual assured destruction. And Lynn said, this is insane. We have to have a policy which that guards against nuclear war, but does it in a way that the world works together. And making peace with Russia is the end of the British Empire's division of the world into East versus West, absolutely required for their geopolitics to keep the third world in a state of backwardness, so that you would have access to cheap labor, cheap raw materials, and so forth. And therefore, LaRouche became enemy number one, that he was moving the Reagan administration. And at the same time, by the way, he was moving the Reagan administration to recognize what LaRouche identified as the debt bomb, meaning that the only way to deal with the emerging crisis of debt in the emerging developing sector was to, in fact, move towards a moratorium on the debt and establish new global financial system, which would allow for funds going into development, not IMF conditionalities where the funds were only refinancing bad debt and using the debt to control the third world and keep it backwards. So this was what led to their attack on LaRouche. Now you look at what's happening today. Why Russiagate? Why did Trump have Russiagate? I think people remember, although it's a little hard to remember because Trump doesn't represent these ideas, at least publicly anymore. But when he ran for office, he said, it's a good thing, not a bad thing to be friends with Russia. I'm going to be friends with Russia. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. Over and over and over, he said that. And he said that it's a good thing to be friends with China, but we had a very serious trade problem with China. And if you recall, not only did he meet with Putin, but he traveled to China. He had a wonderful visit. He came back praising China as a great nation, Xi Jinping as a great leader. Now, what people remember now is that Trump eventually gave in. He was unable to implement almost anything he tried to do. He could not pull out of the regime change wars. He was just told basically go to hell when he said get out of Syria by the military industrial crowd. And he was told by Wall Street when he said we want to rebuild the economy, sorry, we have to bail out the banks. But the key to this was the friendship with Russia and China, and that was destroyed by Russiagate, right? And by those who hate China undermining the Pompeo crowd, the Navarro people, undermining any chance of making peace with China. So rather than going through all the details of that, look what happened with this raid on Trump's house. As Diane said, whether you love Trump or you hate Trump, this is the president of the United States over what they claim has to do with documents, which could be subpoenaed. And in fact, as we now know, the FBI had already gone through all the documents and they'd taken what they wanted and left the rest there back in January, February. This time they raid with a whole slew of people with Uzi machine guns. Go ahead and show that picture of the machine guns outside Trump's house, Jose. I mean, this is pretty amazing. Why do you need some 30 people? No, not that one. The one with the at the Trump house with the machine gun. There you go. That's Trump's house. This guy is standing there with his automatic. I mean, this is pretty amazing. You know, what did they think was going to happen? Well, the point is a show of force, a demonstration of power over who? Over the president, right? And over the presidency in that sense. Here's the president of the United States, whom they're saying wasn't involved. And it's possible because Biden is not involved in very much of what's going on in the administration, at least certain things. But in any case, it's the Biden administration who very likely will be running, if he runs again, against Donald Trump, running a raid on that person's home. And basically openly declaring there was a criminal case being waged against him. Now, think about what Diana's explained on this program before. The Ukrainian hit list put out by the Center for Countering Disinformation in Ukraine, obviously run by MI6 and the CIA, have put out their hit list, financed by the US Congress. The bill that financed the government in Ukraine was led by Chuck Schumer. So here's Chuck Schumer leading the effort to finance a institution in a foreign country, a hostile foreign country, infested with Nazis, right, that are running a campaign against his opponent, putting Diane Sayer on a list which they say are Russian disinformation agents and that they are information terrorists and should be tried as war criminals. I mean, think about the outrageous nature of the complete abandonment of the ideas of the founding of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. Complete abandonment of this, right? Running a global policy, global NATO, they like to call it, which is global. It's not just the US, it's the US and the British, which is in fact being generated by the financial institutions, which are now crumbling and which drives them to think that we are not going to put ourselves through bankruptcy reorganization as LaRouche proposed, because that means we would lose our power. Saving the country would cost the oligarchs the loss of their power. Therefore, we will destroy the emerging opposition, clearly located in the Russia, China, India cooperation, which now has the support of virtually every nation on earth outside of the US and Europe, the Five Eyes, all right? Therefore, we will have war, if necessary, with Russia and China. So obviously, our organization stands in the way. Diane's campaign represents not just a campaign in New York, but a campaign against the core of evil in the Congress, and therefore represents the entire United States, and it represents the entire world. So they're moving against it. Now, look at the picture of the raid on Roger Stone's house. That also was done at 5 o'clock in the morning. Broke down the door, men with machine guns. Here's an old man with no guns, with a deaf wife, and they were there for hours and hours and hours terrorizing them. And of course, CNN was on hand. So I'll tell you a little story. On October 6th of 1986, my wife and I got up and she took the garbage down to the end and noticed there was about 4 or 5 police cars and a CNN truck with video, all standing down at the end of the lane, waiting for something. And then we got a call and found out that our office was being raided in Leesburg. And you can show those pictures now, Jose. The pictures in Leesburg look very familiar to what you saw at Donald Trump's house, carting boxes out of the house. This is carting boxes out of our office. And there's another one of a fellow with the sledgehammer, which he used to beat down the door. He didn't ask us, there you go. They didn't ask us to come and open the door, which they could have. Instead, they chose to beat it down. And they had 400 armed men from many different agencies of government, local, national, as Ramsey Clark said in his testimony. Why? This is a show of power, a show of force, to terrorize you. Not just to terrorize us. And they did terrorize some of our people, you know, that happened. But it meant that the rest of the country was told, don't listen to LaRouche's ideas, as Helga was saying in that testimony. This man is dangerous. And if you dare associate with him, you're going to get the same treatment. As Chuck Schumer said when Trump went after the CIA for their fake Russiagate stuff, oh, watch out, Donald Trump. The CIA has 6 ways from Sunday they can get you. And now that's being carried out, right? So the reality of what happened in that raid, the fact that they did put LaRouche in prison for 5 years, they put me in prison for 77, and I had to serve 10 of those before I finally got paroled. But, you know, we are people of ideas. So the difference between what happened to us and others was that they thought certainly they could crush us, and they didn't. In fact, I used my 10 years very profitably. I like to consider that I had a 10-year sabbatical leave, and as difficult as certain parts of it were, it was a time where I was able to do an incredible amount of research. I became something of a China expert or scholar. Did studies of the Confucian Renaissance compared to the European Christian Renaissance, and was able to basically build a basis upon which we were able, along with the work of Lynn and Helga LaRouche, to make extremely close ties with China, as we did with Russia, and built a situation where today the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians are very consciously building on ideas that come from their own great, rich culture, but with contributions from Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, which they are extremely open to acknowledge and to be thankful for. And that this is, again, the power of ideas. When you reach a point where civilization as it exists deteriorates, that the Western dominant control over the world over these last decades reaches a point where it can no longer maintain that power, that it's collapsing on its own ignorance. The dollar system is collapsing and cannot be fixed. It cannot be resolved. And therefore, the power of ideas become predominant over the power of this kind of oligarchical, military-based and control over the global finances that we've had to live through under the British Empire. And the power of ideas doesn't always show up at the place you might think. It doesn't show up with some wonderful person on a white horse taking over the White House. It shows up by a global movement where nations throughout the world look at these ideas, and that the average citizen who normally doesn't want to think about the future of the world, they don't believe that things are going to collapse the way LaRouche has warned for 50 years. They therefore don't want to think about what we should do about the danger to civilization. But when it hits, as it's hitting now, you have a very, very wide awakening where people who are suddenly confronted with the fact that their own lives are being affected by the hyperinflation, by the very real danger of a nuclear war, which would not be over there. And therefore, people begin to reach out for the power of ideas. They want to find solutions. And this is one of those moments where it's a moment of extreme danger. But because of this LaRouche movement, it is also the moment of perhaps the greatest opportunity in all of our lifetimes to achieve the kind of dramatic global change in the way that the world as a whole works, and in the way in which people think, because they're driven, as Percy Shelley said in his Defense of Poetry, that at times of crisis like this, people suddenly become capable of understanding and conveying very powerful ideas about man and nature that normally they don't. This is one of those poetic moments in history. So this is a time where people can and must see through the danger and the fear and grasp the optimism. If there's ever been a case of expressing that optimism, it's the absolutely incredible case of Diane Sayer's campaign against Chuck Schumer, achieving the impossible when they totally changed the laws in order to make sure that she could not get on the ballot, and we did anyway. And that now the world as a whole, and I can tell you briefly, I spend a few days a week calling our friends and supporters in the UK and in Australia and in New Zealand. And many people are coming to us and reaching out to us. That's why we have literally thousands of people in those countries coming to us by watching Harley Schlanger on his daily blog. But many of them are watching Diane Sayer. Why are they watching Diane Sayer? She's running for an office in the United States with them, right? Well, it does. It does. It's a statement to the world that there are people in the United States, even within the political system, who represent not only sanity, but brilliance, represent solutions. And people everywhere are very, very hungry for solutions. And when they see a video of Lyndon LaRouche, an interview with Helga Zepp LaRouche, or they see Diane Sayer, what they see is somebody who is addressing the reality of the current crisis with an idea of uplifting mankind to the dignity of man and ending the degrading kind of life that's being forced upon people around the world, that's been enforced on people in the developing sector for decades and decades and decades, and is now coming home to roost, so to speak, in Europe and the United States. And therefore, we have a potential which has never been as great as it is today. So I'm very glad to be able to participate in Diane's symposium tonight, and I'll stop at that.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks very much. And I think it's very hard to imagine actually what it might be like to wake up early one morning and find the FBI, the police, marshals waiting outside your door with the news media. I'm hoping that that kind of thing will become a thing of the past. We can do our job, but let's go now to Dennis Speed. Dennis?
Yes. You able to hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, the thing that might be harder to imagine is to wake up one morning and find that the FBI no longer exists. Now, that is the thing, the great dream, the new dream that everybody needs to have in the United States, a la Martin Luther King. This is important. If you happen to see, if you didn't tune in too late, to see what Helga LaRouche had to say, in particular, about the idea of the power of ideas, and that trying to jail an idea is a great crime. Or what the former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, who, remember, for those who don't know, Clark personally accompanied Martin Luther King on his march in 1965 from Selma to Montgomery, not as a participant in the march, but to protect Martin Luther King at that time. And the major area of danger that Martin Luther King was actually in jeopardy from were circles around the FBI, particularly J. Edgar Hoover. So one should understand that what we're talking about, what people find themselves talking about today in the United States, around the nature of what's happening with the presidency and what happened with the raid, or whether there was evidence, or whether in fact it was justified, is something that people for decades have ducked, confronting, and now you can no longer duck it. But what's also important is that there's a method to fight. There's a method to actually win. And I'm happy to say that our organization has played a role, and in specific, Diane's campaign played a certain role, that after this attack that some of you have heard about, it's been in various news media. It's been covered by people on the internet like Jimmy Dore, Breaking Point, it's been covered in Newsweek, and other publications in the United States, the so-called Ukrainian blacklist, which included Glenn Greenwald and Senator Rand Paul and Tulsi Gabbard, and various whistleblowers like Scott Ritter and so on, but specifically included Diane Sayre, Jason Ross of the Schiller Institute, Harley Schlanger, Helga LaRouche, and so members of our organization, also Ulf Sandmark, one of our members of our organization from Denmark. So these people were also on the list. And the first 30 people on the list were all persons that had attended a conference that the Schiller Institute had called for the purpose of discussing how one might establish a new security and development architecture that would bring peace to the world as a whole. Now, here's what has happened. That Center for Countering Disinformation, the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation, has removed the list from its site. This happened sometime yesterday. That's definitely a victory in that they were being extremely belligerent, obnoxious, and aggressive toward many. For example, the same crew from the Ukrainian National Security Council forced the television station CBS to take down a story that they had planned to show yesterday, I believe, as a broadcast, which criticized, well, essentially exposed the fact that approximately 30%, or 1/3, less than 1/3, of all the weapons that were being shipped to Ukraine were actually reaching the Ukrainian front lines. The rest were disappearing up in smoke, and they the investigators from CBS had talked to various people on the ground in Ukraine with whom they had interviews. And what happened was that they made the mistake of putting a trailer up which showed what the documentary was going to be about. And what happened was that forces associated with the Ukrainian government made them take that down. Now that should not have happened. I mean, why would the Ukrainian government have that power over an American media institution like CBS, for whom Walter Cronkite had worked and who had criticized the Vietnam War and was the first person from whom many Americans heard that the Vietnam War was being lost? Well, the answer is Ukraine does not have that power. They didn't make that happen. It's said that they made that happen, but that had to be done through the State Department of the United States, the City of London's British intelligence factions, and others. That is, the nature of that power to make that happen could not have been implemented. It could not have been effected by Ukraine. Just like this blacklist, really, which included all sorts of people, including supporters of Ukraine, could not have been put up and promulgated without the knowledge of the United States State Department and various persons in it. So when you look at what happened with Donald Trump and you look at what's going on with the blacklist, the thing that I think many can take comfort in is the following. The forces associated with Lyndon LaRouche have a method of fighting, not just fighting back, but fighting. And while it can be said that that somehow did not work in the case of Lyndon LaRouche's incarceration, that would be wrong. It is true that the suppression of Lyndon LaRouche, leading to his incarceration on January 27th of 1989, something that was carried out by George Herbert Walker Bush and the circles around him, who then came into the ascendancy in the presidency. That is a process that we were incapable as an organization of stopping at that time. But that was because people, there was a certain cordon around us, and that cordon could be effective. Now, there's a different problem. The nation of China, the nation of Russia, the presidency of Donald Trump, the ascendance of various portions of Africa and Asia and South America, and the mad, old, diseased, and dying character of the culture of the transatlantic world, including the absolutely asinine policy of sanctions, which of course has, in one sense, backfired, but in a more perverted sense has worked exactly the way they wanted it to. Has these policies and this configuration, which I just named, has created a completely different fabric, a different field of action on which forces such as ourselves are able to do some things that nobody can do. Now, this is not because we have any significant physical force, obviously, nor is it the case that it's because we have these great intelligence contacts who are listening to us. That's not true either. That may be the case that we have some people. No, it's because of the nature of the actual fabric of reality. You know, there's a saying, the arc of the moral universe, or the moral arc of the universe, sometimes said, is long, but it bends toward justice. Now, people, particularly those who have decided that God is dead, don't believe in forces in the universe larger than the vicinity of what's between their own ears. And there's something that Lyndon LaRouche had to say about that, which I think we're going to be able to put up on the screen. He was referring to, it's from something called On the Issue of Mindset. And I think if you've got that, we'll talk about that here. This is something that Lyndon LaRouche wrote back in the year 2000. It was actually written by him at a point that he was now out of jail for a period of 6 years and had been in dialogue with members of the Russian Academy of Social Sciences. And so here's what he had to say about what he called the issue of mindset. He said, those among us still active, do you have it there? Thank you. Those among us still active after fighting in political wars for the past half century or longer have access to a relatively unique and invaluable store of personal experience. To us, it is all too obvious that ours is an experience commanded by virtually none among those, mostly a generation or two younger than ourselves, who occupy most of the leading public and private positions today. Today's still active elder statesmen, born during or shortly after the Great War of 1914-1917, have lived through such times as the onset of the Great Depression and the ensuing wars, the needless dropping of 2 nuclear bombs on the helpless civilian population of Japan, the prolonged threat of global nuclear conflict, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now an Anglo-American dominated world which is toppling like some self-doomed Ozymandias at the brink of the worst, most awful financial collapse in more than 100 years. With that present financial crisis has come the recent and presently escalating eruption of forms of warfare and related conflict which now threaten to escalate worldwide. We veterans, especially those among us still on duty, often wonder if those younger folk in charge of most posts today will learn in time the urgently needed lessons from the results of the tragic blunders committed during today's preceding century. Primary lesson of modern history is that the greatest follies of nations unfold over periods of 1 or 2 generations. There was no great folly in history which was not the ruling opinion of a decade or longer. The greatest follies are the generally accepted delusions which wreak havoc on their believers a generation or so after they have become the ruling policy-shaping trends. The greatest follies of all known human history, even before modern times, have been the fruit dropped from a generation or more of stubbornly prevailing trends in official public opinion. There is no greater fool than is usually to be found among those leaders of today's nations who imagine that the utopian delusions of globalism, the induced prejudices peculiar to their generation, are axiomatically the work of a triumphant imperial wisdom. So the generational and related cycles of true life tragedy of nations unfold. I'll simply add that on such a full sea are we now afloat. So our situation is that we have to act because the tide, the present tide in the affairs of men requires it. You will not escape by trying to refer to anything in your recent experience of the last 5 years to understand what happened to Donald Trump. You will come up with no explanation whatsoever that will assist you in this situation. You can, however, in working with our organization and with the ideas that our organization is trying to promulgate in the form of dialogues, discussions, exchanges of ideas, arrive at an apprehension of what to do, because our organization's dialogue process is designed to equip people to act in this circumstance to defeat precisely what we are confronted by. And in the case of this Ukraine Center for the Countering of Disinformation, which is a killer organization, literally a killer organization, we have achieved a significant, small but significant victory. This doesn't mean they're not still trying to silence people or they don't have a kill list. It means that they don't think any longer that it is wise to leave it up there because they're taking a beating because of the responses of people from Denmark, Germany, and many other countries, much of which we will be discussing in a show that will happen tomorrow, which will be on the LaRouche organization site. We'll go through that. And those of you who have subscribed to various publications can also get that EIR and so on, which Mike works for. So I'd like to just stop there.
Great, thank you. I just, so you know, in the comments, many people have said how much they appreciated the clip from the memorial, which showed some of the background on the LaRouche case and what was said about this, because there may be a number of people who are younger and don't recall those dark days of the attempt to silence LaRouche, which is still ongoing, which is why this year, September 8th, just under 4 weeks away, is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Lyndon LaRouche, and we want to actually have a big day of action with public rallies and things on social media, and then there'll be a conference following that on September 10th and 11th of the Schiller Institute. So that's one thing everyone should put their calendar down for that weekend. I was just thinking about some of the things that have occurred, which for Americans, because our news media is so terrible, may not be aware. One, the intense pressure, for example, put on President Widodo of Indonesia to disinvite Russia, to not have Russia participate in the G20 meeting, which he refused to back down to that. You had just a couple of days ago, Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, visiting South Africa. He was on the podium with the Foreign Minister of South Africa, and rather than trying to propitiate him and act as though South Africa was coming from an inferior position, she took the opportunity to give him a lecture saying that we don't appreciate leaders who come and bully us. We don't tell us you do or else. You have no business telling us that we should not work with China. We will work with whatever nations we please. And I'm sharing these things because the U.S. has no credibility in the world anymore. We are dangerous from our military standpoint, and perhaps disruptive. For example, we've caused tens of thousands of newborn infants to die of starvation in Afghanistan. So I'm not saying we're not a threat to the world, but we have no credibility. And many people from around the world have visited the United States. They know the shape of our infrastructure. They know we have children opening fire and killing dozens of people in our schools. They know we had 100,000 drug overdose deaths last year. So this is not a mystery. It was the intention of LaRouche and mine and Mike and Dennis, everyone who worked with him, that we are going to completely reverse the insane trajectory that we have been on these last really 75 plus years since the end of World War II. And I also used those two examples just because I wanted to flesh out a bit more what I mean. Why are they trying to go for dictatorship? Why are they being so heavy-handed right now to prevent electoral process, like saddling me, an independent candidate, with getting 45,000 signatures? It is not from the standpoint of strength that they do this, but because they're losing their grip. People aren't willing to go along with the arbitrary rules in the so-called rules-based order. And I think that is what makes this incredible opportunity that Mike spoke about. So Mike, if you have other thoughts or more you would like to add, please go ahead.
Yeah, this event on September 8th and 10th and 11th would have been Lynn's 100th birthday. These are international events. The conferences we've held over the last 2 years were international events. There were some fools, even some fools associated with our organization, who thought that we had to restore the American system by blocking out the rest of the world and just organizing for America, 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 America first. It's stupid. It's failed. There's no way you're going to save America from within America. None. where is the American system? The American system is now being expressed as a global phenomena in opposition to global NATO, and its center is in China and in India and in Russia and in South Africa. Of the American have been kept alive to a great extent because Lyndon LaRouche spent about half of his life meeting with Indira Gandhi, with Sergei Glaziev, with key people from China, from South Africa, from South America, from Brazil, from Argentina, right? And as a result, the American system is alive and well. It's unfortunately extremely sick within the United States. But it's alive and well. And we have reason to be optimistic because we can restore what was great about the American system by bringing to bear an international movement which works hand in hand with the institution of the presidency in the United States, not the fools in the White House, not the traitors in the Congress, where there's very few exceptions to that term, but with the institutions of farmers, of working people, of other kinds of institutions, local governments, which are looking with us around the world to find what we need to do to restore an American system kind of economy on the world. What Lynn and Helga have always called as the new Bretton Woods, to do what Roosevelt did when the whole world was shattered in 1944, before the war ended. But he brought leading people together and said, we have to have a world financial system which actually addresses the needs for development of every country on earth. And especially, we have to restore sanity and development to the countries that have been subjected to colonialism and neocolonialism for centuries. Unfortunately, he died. And the Bretton Woods system was only partially implemented. The ideas of the British, Lord Keynes, who published his great book on the general theory first in Nazi Germany, because he said, we need a country like Nazi Germany to implement my ideas. And indeed, unfortunately, those ideas did undermine the ability of the original idea of bringing the world out from under colonial hell and building a world based on the common dignity of all men, of all nations. That is what we have now. We have the American system, ironically, in the sense of the economic Hamiltonian system, being implemented in China, whereas here in the United States, it's been completely destroyed, and we're now completely functioning under the British system, where the banks run the economy, not the elected representatives, not your government, right? So as a result, we have a potential of the LaRouche ideas bringing the world together. And that is, in fact, the only way we're going to restore some sort of sanity, stop this mad descent towards war with Russia and China, and figure out the necessary means by which we get people in the United States to sit down with the Russians, with the Chinese. And many might say, oh, this is impossible. Our governments are not going to do that. Look at the insanity we have leading the US, leading the UK. But we're only beginning to see the shocks that are going to hit this economy, that's going to hit our social system. And it could be ugly. It could get violent. I think there's efforts to provoke every kind of hot button issue to get people fighting each other, whether it's over the administration, if it's over abortion, if it's over drugs, if it's over any hot button issue, to keep people fighting each other, rather than thinking about the fact that we're facing a general breakdown crisis of the entire world financial system, the Western financial system, and the threat of nuclear war. And these things can be resolved. They can be resolved because this is that rare moment where people are suddenly recognizing the danger and beginning to use their creative powers to think about what we need to do for mankind as a whole in a way that they normally don't allow themselves to do, or are they kept from doing with the ugly entertainment and the drugs and the perversity and so forth. Now it's possible at this moment. So again, I think it's the optimism that we have to induce and bring out in people, and that this campaign is ready-made to do exactly that, because it's mission impossible achieved, having gotten Diane on the ballot. And now we can actually fight to bring down Chuck Schumer, but bring down Chuck Schumer by doing it in a way that we bring forward ideas that actually are grasped and implemented by the vast majority of people, not only in New York, but throughout the world.
Great, thanks. Dennis, are you still there? I know you have to run, so I wanted to see if you had some final thoughts.
I think Mike basically said what needed to be said. I think that the best present you could give Lyndon LaRouche on his 100th birthday would be to exonerate him. I think that's something that might become an actually doable thing, particularly among people who have a sense of humor and actually want to get back at the people that knocked on Donald Trump's door in a very unceremonious way. Because they're knocking on the door of the presidency of the United States. People want to try to reduce it to Trump. Forget it. It's not what this is. This is a major affront. This is an attempt to take down the executive, something that's been going on ever since really the 1990s in a serious way, mostly being led through British intelligence, which wants to reduce the United States presidency and the United States Congress to a parliamentary system. They want to reduce people's conception to that of a parliamentary democracy, which would be a terrible form of government. Whereas a constitutional republic of a democratic nature, which is what we have, that's the way to govern. And I think that therefore this idea of exonerating LaRouche on his 100th birthday, not meaning necessarily September 8th, but in the course of the year of his birthday, would be the best way to accomplish a lot of things, make a lot of people really angry, get a lot of people really scared, and get a lot of other people having a really good time.
Thank you. So I think we will conclude. I want to thank both of you for being here. I would encourage everybody watching to think about what you are going to do to celebrate the 100th birthday of the greatest mind that our republic has yet produced toward this end. And I also would encourage everyone, if you have not read one of LaRouche's papers or books, he was an unbelievably prolific writer and speaker. And if you visit the site LaRouche Pub, that is LaRouchepub, as in short for publications, LaRouchePub.com, you will find many, many papers written by LaRouche over the years on almost any topic, any part of the world that you might be interested in. And I would urge everyone to make it your business between now and September 8th to get a hold of something by LaRouche, read it, study it. I think doing that, you will begin to see why I say that he is the greatest mind that our nation has yet produced. And the point is, that's not supposed to be the end of production. We have to get his name cleared so that future generations can stand on his shoulders and build on the breakthroughs that he made in a way that didn't happen for generations after Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was very much suppressed during and after his life, or the work of Johann Sebastian Bach. And to suppress the works of people who were great geniuses, as Helga was saying during her comments on those hearings to investigate human rights abuses in the United States, that is the real crime. It's suppressing the creativity which could be happening, the advances which should be being made right now. So thank you everybody for being here, for participating. Please, if you haven't yet, sign up at fairforsenate.com. I will say we are planning major forward initiatives. We just picked 45,000 pieces of literature up from the printer today. I'm planning to get billboards in Manhattan, and the campaign needs your support. So I'd urge you also to make a donation to the campaign to help do all of this, and sign up to help get the get everything out and moving. And also, if you want to participate in a rally anywhere on the 8th of January, that would be great. So thank you very much, and I hope that we will see everybody here next week.